What's up guys, I'm Rich from Spray Black Studios and today we're going to be building a diorama based on a popular Hollywood film. So recently I was approached by the owner of a company called Pagan Miniatures with a fairly interesting idea. They just started fulfilling the pledges on their new Kickstarter, The Sons of Odin, which features some absolutely awesome Viking and werewolf sculpts. Now Adam, the head honcho over at Pagan Miniatures, pinged me a message saying that he thought I might enjoy making a diorama using a couple of these miniatures. And to be honest, I think he was right. He did, however, suggest that I base the diorama off the movie Reign of Fire. Now, I hadn't seen this film, so obviously I had to go away and do my research with a cup of tea and straight in front of Netflix. But if you haven't seen the film, then it's set in a near future and involves basically the human race awaking dragons in modern times. And it fast forwards on to a post-apocalyptic wasteland where a small pocket of humans are fighting against the overwhelming force of these dragons that have basically destroyed most of the earth. Now, there's quite a lot of good action in this, but there's one particular scene that stands out. And that is featuring Matthew McConaughey in one of his rare features that's not a chick flick. And in this scene, his character throws himself off some scaffolding, swinging his axe wildly, straight in to the jaws of a dragon. Now, this video isn't sponsored by Pagan Miniatures. I just couldn't resist the challenge that Adam had set. I do, however, really suggest that you go and take a look at their Kickstarter or at their website, which should be going live around about the time of this video or possibly part 2, and take a look at this range of miniatures. As I say, there's some awesome Viking and werewolf miniatures in this with a nice range of different sculpts, and to be honest, they're really good quality, really well sculpted. The majority of the Kickstarter has now shipped, but he is also offering STL files, so if you do want to download and to print these miniatures yourself, you can. So I had the inspiration for the diorama set, but now I need to choose the miniatures. And again, looking through the Pagan line, there's two that really stood out for me. Now, there aren't any dragons, so we're going to have to be a little bit creative, but I did, however, find this absolutely awesome werewolf sculpt that, I mean, it's just beckoning an oncoming attacker with the pose and just screaming up at the sky. I think it was perfect. For the Viking, I found one that, again, the pose just fits absolutely perfect for what we're looking. And to be honest, he actually looks slightly like Matthew McConaughey in this film. Now, normally I tend to want to get a bit of a solid plan in place when doing a diorama like this, but I thought that we'll try it a little bit more freeform with this. So I'll take inspiration where it comes as we go through the building process, and I'll bring you along for the ride. Firstly, I found myself a nice base for the diorama. Now, this was one of a handful of nice diorama bases that I managed to pick up for fairly cheap on eBay recently. And as I'm going to be building and painting the diorama directly onto this base, I wanted to make sure that I didn't ruin that nice finish. So using some masking tape, I just covered up all of those edges just to give them some protection. Now, if I'm going to replicate this scene, I'm going to need something for the Viking to jump off of. So I'm going to have to build up some height on this base. As this is going to be a display diorama, I don't need anything particularly strong or solid, so some simple polystyrene from some insulation board will do the job nicely. And using a Sharpie, I marked out a rough idea of the size of the pieces that I wanted. To cut the polystyrene, you can use a nice sharp knife, but I always find a hot wire tool to be a much better bet. It's fairly efficient and it makes a lot less mess. You can get all manner of these tools from various hobby stores, including large bench mounted ones, but this little tool was purchased off Amazon for about £15, and so far it's done all I've needed it to. Now I wanted this to build up some height, so using the hot wire tool again, I'm going to cut out 2 pieces from this block, and then using some Mod Podge I'll stick these together, getting the position on the base where I know that I'm going to want them. Mod Podge is basically an upgraded PVA glue. It's a little bit stronger and a bit more better suited for terrain building, and it won't cause any problems with melting or damaging the polystyrene like other glues might. Having stuck these pieces together, I do want to make it look a bit more like a cliff face. So grabbing out that hot wire tool again, I'm going to angle one side of it. I waited until I had glued these two together so that I could do them both at once and make sure that I get the same angle going across. With a bit more Mod Podge, I'll get it stuck into position, and then it's time to prep the next step. For the rest of the landscaping on the base, I'm going to use some DAS clay. This stuff is pretty much just a better version of what a lot of us used in school. So tearing off a few chunks of this, I'm going to start to work it into that recess and slowly build up a nice uneven surface. At the moment, even though it's pretty messy, I'll just use my fingers to get it all into position. Tools can help, but they're definitely not necessary. To smooth the clay out, I'm going to go back to my days of doing art in school. One of my favourite things about working with clay was the mess that we caused, and that was because we used to use water to get a nice smooth finish. Dunking a finger into the water pot and then gently running it over the clay will give a lovely smooth finish without any finger marks or prints. Now I want to give this cliff a nice rocky effect. I'm not, however, going to achieve it using Rocky Road, and inside this pot is actually some of the Geek Gaming Scenics modelling compound. A secret combination of various things including paper and plaster. This stuff is great for cliffs or for rocky surfaces. Adding in some water and getting it to a consistency similar to that of the papier-mâché that we again used to use in school, I'll start to work this onto the surfaces of the polystyrene. Getting the right consistency is fairly important here, as too wet may cause it to not stick properly, but too dry will also cause it to dry too quickly and to not set or stick properly as well. Practice makes perfect for working out how you want it, but I usually say that you want it sloppy enough that you can run your fingers through it, but thick enough that it'll stick to them as you are mixing. Basically, just a little bit thicker than porridge. Now this is going to take a while for the clay and the modelling compound to set, so I will set this aside for a day or two, just to let it all settle nicely. And we're going to get to work on some of the details. Firstly, we need something for that Viking to be jumping off. I used some simple 5mm styrene rod to create the scaffolding for the walkway, measuring out a very rough length that I want the walkway to come out from the cliff face. I'll use a sharp craft knife to cut through this. You may want to use a small saw blade if you have one, but I found the craft knife to be sufficient. You've just got to be a little bit careful not to cut yourself. These two parts will give me the parallels for the scaffolding, and then we need to cut ourselves a nice stabilising piece. To get these all to stick together nicely, I'm going to be pinning them, and using a pin vise I'll drill holes into each end of the stabilising piece and in the corresponding position on the two parallel supports. Using a dab of super glue and a cut down dressmaker's pin, I'll attach these pieces together, and then I'll actually use the lines on my cutting mat to ensure that I can get them sitting as straight as possible. Now this scaffolding needs some legs, and I'm going to attach these in very much the same manner. Again, using some super glue and a pin to get them to stick properly. I'll try my hardest to ensure a nice right angle, but as I do want this to look a little bit more ramshackle and a bit post-apocalyptic, this isn't make or break. Now once the clay and the modelling compound are nice and solid, I can start to attach our walkway. Using a couple of pins and some super glue again, I'm going to fix it into position. Now, due to the uneven surfaces, a little bit of trimming may be required, but I was actually pretty lucky here and it sat really nicely. For the wooden planks on the walkway, I'm actually going to use a tip from Jeremy over at Black Magic Craft, and I'm going to use some lollipop sticks. Now, these are a little bit too wide for the scale of our miniatures and for the scaffolding poles, so after cutting off those rounded ends, I'll use a craft knife to cut them in half lengthways. Again, I don't need to be exact here, as I do want them to look a little bit worn, and I will be adding some wear and tear. To roughen these pieces up a bit, I'll be using a sanding attachment on my Dremel tool. Running this down the edges of the lollipop sticks will soften those angles a bit, but it'll also make them look a lot less uniform and a little bit more worn and aged, like bits have just gradually eroded or chipped off over time. I'd say pretty perfect for a post-apocalyptic world. You could use your craft knife again here, but I feel that the sanding attachment will give a better effect, and it also shouldn't cause the wood to splinter or to split. These planks are too long for the scaffolding though, so with the craft knife again, I'll cut them in half and double the amount of planks that we have. To glue the pieces in place, I'm going to use a couple of dabs of super glue and then just place them onto the scaffolding. Again, we definitely don't need to get them perfectly horizontal. I do want them to be a little bit uneven and just look a little bit more beaten up. For the top of the cliff, I can't use super glue as that glue would melt right through that polystyrene. Instead, we'll go back to the good old trusty Mod Podge and then just place the planks into position and let them dry for a while. For some rubble and some fallen down rocks at the foot of the cliff face, I'm going to use some cut up pieces of cork and glue them down using the Mod Podge again. I'll generally try and scatter these pieces on as they give a much more random positioning. I often find that my brain always wants to lay them down in a much more uniform pattern if I actually try it. I'll also add a few patches just dotted around the base as well. For the texture on the ground itself, I want it to look like a bit of a blasted wasteland, so I'm going to be using a mixture of different sized grains of modelling sand all mixed together. Obviously, again, using our friend Mod Podge to glue this all down, I'll be fairly generous with both the glue and the sand, but I'm going to do it progressively in patches. Now, there are so many ways you can do this, whether it be via the Geek Gaming Scenics Base Ready range, or by using things like the Vallejo or Citadel texture paints, but I find that modelling sand is a pretty cheap and a very simple method that gives pretty good results. So now I've got the base and the walkway built, I'm going to use another product from Luke, and that is the sealant spray. Giving the base a decent coat of this will add some more strength into holding that sand down nicely to protect the base a bit more. Now I'm pretty happy with how the base is looking now. There's a nice bit of texture on it and the walkway is looking nice and prominent. I feel that I do need to build up a little bit more interest on that base, however, and just to fill in some of that negative space. Now in the film there is a slightly weird mix of present day elements and slightly more fantasy elements, so this is something that I actually did want to capture within this diorama, and for this we're going to put in some defences. For the foot of the cliff I'm going to build up some razor wire. Using the same technique that I used for a base in a previous video, I'm going to again use some of that styrene rod and some of the Army Painter Battlefield razor wire. This stuff is great as simple, ready-made razor wire that is just super easy to use. You can use it straight out of the tub, but with the addition of some posts made from this styrene rod, you can make it look much more realistic. Cutting down some short sections of the rod with a craft knife and then drilling a hole right through one end of the rod, this will give us some nice supports for the wire. The wire itself comes in a large coil, so I'm going to unwind a length that I need and chop it with a pair of side cutters, bearing in mind that if you intend on coiling it like Battlefield razor wire, normally you're going to need a length quite a lot longer than the length of the razor wire you're intending on creating. If you want a simple way to coil this, then grab a paintbrush and using the handle of the brush, just wind the wire around it and press down firmly. This will cause it to coil up nicely and it should slide straight off the brush handle. I'll now thread the posts onto the wire and get them into the rough position that I'm going to want them. In this case, it did cause the wire to straighten out a little bit, but it was pretty easily manipulated back into shape using my fingers. To glue the posts into position, I'm going to use some super glue, but to ensure that we get a lovely quick adhesion, I'm going to use the Army Painter super glue activator to get this glue to set almost instantly. This prevents me from getting super glue all over my fingers, which can be easily done when using something this fiddly. The chemical reaction of this super glue activator does unfortunately come with a slight side effect, and that is a build-up where it is applied. To cover this up, I'm going to use one of the Citadel texture paints, the Astro Granite Debris, to give me a nice muddy texture at the foot of all these posts. I'll also give a little bit of build-up at the foot of the scaffolding too, just to keep it looking the same. Now I just need to add some defences in to the top of that cliff, and this is where I'm going to bring in a little bit more of that fantasy element. Needing something simple, I thought I'd use a very simplified version of the Cheval de Frise, which were defences used in the Middle Ages to defend against cavalry. For this, I'm going to use some cocktail sticks glued into the polystyrene at an angle to form the sharpened stakes, and then using some super glue and some of the Gale Force 9 jeweler's chain, I'll connect these all together. Now I know that we aren't featuring any dragons, but these would definitely make any airborne or mounted attackers have some second thoughts. Now we just need to decide on the positioning, and with the posing of this Viking, really there was only one option. To have him jumping off the end of the walkway, just like in the film. So to do this, I'm going to use a fairly long dressmaker's pin. I did look at a few options for transparent plastic, but I couldn't find anything strong enough that didn't look too out of place. With the Viking in position, the werewolf was nice and simple. With his pose so open, it was easy to position him looking straight at that Viking, getting ready to bat him out of the air. And with that final touch, the diorama is ready for some paint. I wanted to keep this fairly simple as I do want the focus to be on the two miniatures themselves, but I've got to be honest, I'm really happy with how this came out and I'm actually really looking forward to getting some paint on it. Now this is video number 1 in a 2-part series, so you can probably guess what's going to be coming next. As part of the brief for this video, it was suggested that I might want to give this just a little bit of a grimdark twist, so check out the next video to see how I make this fit in a nice post-apocalyptic world. As mentioned earlier in this video, I do really suggest you check out Pagan Miniatures, who are the company that made the 2 miniatures that I used for this video. Their new website should be live fairly soon, so go check out the range and get yourself some beautiful minis. If you've enjoyed this video, then please let me know by hitting that like button down below and by sticking a comment on. These diorama build videos, I don't know how well they're going to do, but they're something that I've not done much before, but I actually really enjoy doing. They obviously just take a lot of time in the actual build and in the editing process as well. And the second part of this series will be coming shortly, but I do also have a few other nice tutorials that I think you might be interested in. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, that way you won't miss out when I upload them. Thank you again for tuning in, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. And remember, if all else fails, spray it black and start again.